Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Emily Tanner. I'm a programme head in education, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here today on behalf of the Nuffield Foundation. To all of you in the room and to all joining online, we're really pleased that you could join us. Nuffield Foundation has a long-standing interest in the teacher workforce, recognising the centrality of the quality to the educational experience and outcomes of students. And I'm sure we'll all agree, never has it been more important to inform the debate with high quality evidence, which is what we're doing today. We are delighted to welcome 4 of our grant holders who are going to share their research findings today. And we are hugely thankful to them and also to our expert panel and to David Laws, who's chairing our event. We're also pleased to have with us Matilda Martin, who's covering the event. If there are any comments that you want to say off the record, please just signal when you speak. So a few words of housekeeping before I pass to do please use the Twitter hashtag that you can see on the slide. We will be recording the event and sharing along with the slides after the event. Please have a word with us if you have any concerns about that. We aren't expecting any fire alarms, so if a bell sounds, please leave by both doors and Nuffield staff will direct you to it. And we don't have a scheduled break. We're running for 2 hours. So if you do need to leave the room, please feel free to do so by the door at the back. And the toilets are either side of the lift as you came in, and there are drinks outside. So when we come to the questions, I urge you to speak into the microphone so that the online audience can hear. Pass round, and that will be really helpful. Thank you. And for those of you online, please use the Q&A box to ask questions, and we'll bring those in. And if you have any questions at all, please ask one of us from the Nuffield Foundation. So now I'd like to welcome David Laws, Executive Chair of the Education Policy Institute, who is chairing our event today. Thank you, David.
Emily, thank you very much indeed for inviting me along to chair this very interesting session. I think that Emily's given me and Josh has given me quite a challenge as chair, because they've given us 4 great researchers to talk about their work today. They've given us 3 fantastic expert panelists to discuss that. And we're going to do all of this in just 2 hours with quite a large audience, with many people who've got a lot to contribute to this debate. All of that means I need to be fairly short and sweet in my introduction. So I wanted to just say 3 things. Firstly, sincere thanks to the Nuffield Foundation for funding these fantastic projects that we are discussing today, and for hosting this event, which I think is going to be extremely valuable. Nuffield, as all of you know, is one of the most important and I think most impactful funders of social research, including education research, in this country. And if it didn't exist in its existing form, it would most certainly need to be invented. So thanks to Emily, to Josh and the team. The second thing I was going to say is that I'm really delighted that we are focusing on this particular subject. I think over the last few years, policymakers themselves in the UK and other countries have come to realise that the issue of the workforce has been a relatively neglected area amongst a lot of focus on funding and structural reform. So I think that this is an important area in and of itself. It's also, as we're going to hear from the presentations, extremely topical at the moment because of the very serious challenges that we've got in terms of attracting, retaining and deploying our teacher workforce. So I think it's very topical to be discussing it now. And finally, I'm delighted that 4 of the presentations that we're hearing about today are really relevant to that policy debate, and I think really interesting to researchers. I was always struck in my time in the DFE by the very limited extent to which research from the outside world is seen by and used effectively by policymakers. And I think that's partly a problem with government, but sometimes it's a problem with researchers communicating to government and also producing research that is timely, topical, interesting, and solutions orientated. And in the case of the presentations today, all of them tick all of those boxes. And I'm sure that policymakers will be interested in all of those areas that we're going to be discussing today. Indeed, somebody told me, I can't remember who it was, that Jack's research that we're going to hear about in a moment was being waived in the face of the Secretary of State relatively recently by one of the trade unions during the current negotiations on teacher pay. I don't know whether that's true or not. We might find out from Patrick later on, but I would certainly like to think it is, because if policy debates in the DfE are being informed by high quality research and evidence, that is a good thing and a big step forward. So finally, before we start, just a quick word on the format of all of this. We're going to start with those 4 presentations. Jack's got 20 minutes, the others have got 10. I'll try to keep them strictly to time. And then we will deal with the Q&A after the 4 presentations. So we'll hear each of them, and then we'll open it up both to those people who are joining virtually and to all of you in the room today. And we'll keep the questions very much on those 4 presentations rather than trying to go more widely. We've then got 3 fantastic expert panelists who will be here to talk about the issues that have been raised. They each have 5 or 6 minutes to give us their reflections, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A again to the same 2 groups, and that Q&A can be fairly unconstrained on wider issues. They're obviously around the workforce and teaching rather than more broadly, and hopefully we will bring that to an end at 12:30 when I think you're invited to stay for lunch, discussions, and a chat outside. So without further ado, can I introduce the first panelist who's going to be presenting today, Jack Worth, the lead economist at NFER, whose work I think will be well known to all of you here today. Jack.
There we go. Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much for the Nuffield Foundation for hosting us here today to talk about this really important topic. And also very grateful to the Nuffield Foundation for supporting the research that we've been doing on the teacher workforce, I think going back to about 2016, doing different projects to understand and increase public understanding of the issues in the teaching workforce. So very grateful for the support that Nuffield have been able to give to us and to other researchers to understand this topic at the moment. So yes, I'm given 20 minutes at the beginning to kind of set the scene and kind of motivate why we're talking about some of this stuff. Great responsibility to have a bit longer, so I'll keep it to time the best I can. But in the moment we find ourselves in at the moment, and kind of basing it around the current situation and the real challenges that we're facing after the pandemic in terms of teacher recruitment and retention. Particularly focusing on England, because we've been through a journey over the last few years in terms of what's been happening through the pandemic, but the situation we find ourselves in now, it both has similarities to what's been going on over the last decade, but also an intensification, which is important to think about and to address. To start with, a kind of motivation of why this is such a big challenge at the moment. So a really key indicator of whether we have enough teachers, of teacher supply, is how many teachers are coming through into initial teacher training, postgraduate initial teacher training, compared to how many we need going with teachers, well supplied with teachers. So the Department for Education estimates a target for how many teachers need in each subject, and that's compared against the postgraduate intake of teacher trainees. every year. So you can see that at the beginning of the decade, just after the financial crisis, secondary recruitment was kind of meeting the target. There had been challenges before that, but obviously the recession tends to support teacher recruitment. There were fewer job opportunities elsewhere. And then throughout the latter part of the decade, this under-recruitment, particularly of certain subjects, like STEM subjects and foreign languages, was increasing throughout the decade and not meeting the targets. And also the targets were rising. Teachers were leaving, but also numbers starting to increase. Then we had the pandemic a few years ago, so that had a big effect on teacher recruitment by increasing, again, because of the lack of job opportunities, increasing the number of teachers coming into teacher training. So actually the overall number of teachers training in secondary was at the target, not exactly across all subjects, but at the target overall. But then since then, we've seen a real fall in the number of teachers coming into training, and that has fallen. So now, but at the same time, there's also been an increase in the target. So we're now facing a situation where, in the latest official data, we hit 59% of the overall target for secondary teachers. Some subjects more affected than that even. But then in the latest data, where we're able to use live data comes in through every month on applications to teacher training, we can see from this year and be fairly certain that the numbers are going to be around half, if not just under half, of the overall numbers required. This is a real challenge of not having enough teachers, new teachers coming through the system to supply what schools will need. Now it's tempting to look at this picture and think, well, this is a recruitment crisis. Therefore, we need to increase recruitment so that we are meeting the target. But I think it's really important to step back from that and think about what teacher supply is all about. It's having enough teachers at school. And the main driver of why the target is so high is because teachers are leaving. So actually improving retention brings the target down and also helps to meet supply. So this is about recruitment, but also, really importantly, about retention. And I'm fond of saying, for every teacher you retain, that's one less teacher you don't have to recruit. And I actually went back to the figures and worked it out. It's actually even better than that. For every 6 teachers you retain, you need to recruit 10 fewer teachers into teacher training, because you lose some along the way that never make it to the state-funded sector, either because they don't achieve QTS or because they go and do something else after their training. So that is the value and the importance of retaining teachers for solving these challenges of teacher supply. Using that, I mentioned there were differences by subjects across all of secondary, but there are real variations by subject. Using the latest applications data and what we know from has happened in previous official data, we can produce a forecast of what initial teacher training versus target is likely to look like across subjects this year. There's still some uncertainty because September and the course is starting just yet. But it's a really quite bleak picture already in terms of the number of trainees coming through, how that compares to the numbers that for education that we need. So we can see here that for primary is around target, but actually only because the primary target has come down this year compared to what it was last year in terms of the rates estimated. But across secondary, it's around half, with other subjects even more affected than that. So physics, design and technology, computing, all subjects that are even further below that. And I've drawn attention there in the middle to, I mean, there have been long-standing problems in terms of attracting enough physics teachers in, but also across all 3 science subjects, there have been real challenges of getting enough teachers. I'm 6'1", so I can, unless you lower the floor, I can't really.
But if you can get a little bit more,
I'll do the kind of. I don't know how to do this. Sorry if everyone online. Hopefully you can still hear me. So this is the extent of the challenge at the moment in some of those really key important subjects, maths, science, English, but a range of other subjects as well. Only 3 subjects anywhere close to likely to meet or exceed their targets. So this is the nature of the challenge. But does this matter? Initial teacher training isn't the only place where teachers come from. So does it matter for schools whether these targets are met? Some research we did recently as part of our Nuffield project was to ask head teachers how easy or difficult they found it to recruit different subjects. And then when we'd gathered that data, we compared it to the previous year of initial teacher training recruitment versus target. And you can see a very clear correlation there in that subjects that don't meet their targets are much more likely to be reported as difficult to recruit for by senior leaders in schools trying to hire teachers. And even some of the outliers kind of make sense in terms of biology over-recruiting its target, but it's easier than it would otherwise expect to, or sort of harder to recruit than you would otherwise expect, because those biology teachers are in demand to cover other shortfalls across science, in terms of physics and chemistry teachers as well. So, a low-tech solution, brilliant. Hopefully that's a bit better online. You can still hear me. So it really matters whether we meet these targets, and there isn't a great supply of teachers waiting to come in if these targets aren't met. These targets really impact how it feels on the ground to recruit teachers. We also asked teachers about what they do when they face teacher shortages, and some of the main reasons, challenges they face in terms of recruitment are around budgets. So budgets are tight both across primary and secondary. But the main challenge they faced in terms of recruitment was about assembling a field of quality candidates, or having issues of suitability of those staff who were applying. So fewer teachers applying, and the quality of that field being low. So then schools are not organisations that can easily carry vacancies, because you can't manage demand or just say, well, fine, we'll carry that vacancy. There are classrooms with teachers needed to staff them. So head teachers find a way to mitigate these challenges. They can recruit a teacher, but sometimes they are recruiting inexperienced or lower quality teachers than they would ideally like. And whether they recruit or not recruit teachers, non-specialist teachers to teach subjects. All of this can have a real impact on the quality of education that's there for people. So this matters not just for teachers and the workforce, this is about the quality of education. Other impacts can be to reduce the non-contact time for existing teachers, which has an impact on their workload. As we'll see in a minute, workload is crucially important, so has an impact on the staff who are currently there. And sometimes it means school leaders doing more teaching, which can impact on the leadership capacity in the school, doing other leadership things. So these are real issues that schools are grappling with as a result of the shortages. I mentioned non-specialist teachers, so we zoomed in on 3 particular subjects. 45% of schools, of secondary schools, say that at least some maths lessons are taught by non-specialist teachers. So that's a really big impact on quality of education, and there's a correlation with how easy or difficult schools generally reported recruitment, with schools finding recruitment the most difficult, being much more likely to deploy non-specialist teachers. So this is the impact feeding through into the people experience in schools. Also, this doesn't affect all schools equally. So this is data taken from a range of different sources, including the school workforce census and school expenditure data. And it shows the variation by level of disadvantage among pupils. So for high FSM schools with the highest level of pupils eligible for free school meals, they tend to have higher attrition, higher turnover, spend more on supply teachers, have more vacancies and temporarily filled posts, and also have much more likely to have non-specialists in maths and science. So this is not affecting all schools equally, and it's has a real impact on kind of leaving rates. We got some new data last week, which fills in the post-pandemic picture. The leaving rate increased during the early part of the decade and then plateaued, and it was actually falling before the pandemic. So there had been some progress in terms of improving retention before then. And then due to the economy and the pandemic, there was a big fall in the leaving rate, but that has jumped back up to the pre-pandemic level last year. Whether that's a temporary increase or a more permanent thing, back up to a more normal level or pre-pandemic level, it remains to be seen, but that's contributing to the number of teachers that need to fill those shortages, those gaps. Also, in terms of what schools are experiencing, this is data from John Housen. I think there he is. Hello, John. Supplied by TeachVac, which is collecting data on teacher vacancies. So there's been a big increase in the number of vacancies that schools are posting in the post-pandemic years. Up to February, which is the latest bit of data we had when we put this report together, it was much higher than it was before the pandemic, which may partly be schools putting in their applications early because they know how tight it's going to be on the labour market. But nonetheless, it's a big increase in the number of vacancies schools are posting and trying to fill. So it's clear that the teacher supply challenges have intensified after the pandemic, and this is addressed through the attractiveness of teaching, whether that's financial or non-financial. We'll have to think about the attractiveness of teaching, how attractive it is both to enter and also to stay in. So there's certainly actions for policymakers, but also school leaders. I'm going to touch on 3 areas in my limited time, which is pay and financial incentives, teacher workload, and working. So to start with the financials, there's been a lot of commentary about teachers' pay this year, given the industrial action and the focus on what that pay should look like in the face of inflation and wage growth in the wider economy. So what we've seen over the last decade is that teachers' salaries have gone down in real terms, so haven't kept up with inflation over that time. They have grown, but not as fast as prices have grown over the same period. So in 21-22, they were 12% lower. And then if we compare to others in terms of other professionals and average earnings, they're much higher in relative terms. So teaching has lost competitiveness. This is likely to be dragging the competitiveness of teaching, the attractiveness of teaching, both for those entering and for those staying. Teacher pay growth, lots of different OECD countries have taken different paths and approaches since 2010 in real terms. England has taken a different path and really stands out as having seen a real reduction in real terms compared to other countries where different approaches have been taken. So what do we know from the evidence about financial incentives as a tool for increasing recruitment and retention? So we know pay is associated with recruitment and retention increases, but that's not just pay in itself, but that's pay relative to what teachers have done outside of teaching. So it really matters how pay is changing compared to outside earnings and what's happening in the wider labour market. So the discussion about teachers' pay, which will be happening over the next few months as the STRB reports, shouldn't be about, well, how much of an increase is it, but how much does that increase relate to how much average earnings are going up. So average earnings are likely to go up by 4% next year, so that's the benchmark comparing to. Also, we have bursaries. We know that they boost recruitment. We know less about the impact on retention, but we're undertaking some research to look at that at the moment. A really important question in terms of, are those additional teachers retained? And also, Sam Sims and colleagues at the UCL have been looking at the early career payments that have been introduced. They seem to boost retention. So there are tools available in the financial policy toolkit to be able to look at increasing recruitment and retention, but obviously they have to be funded. And crucially, some of these can be targeted by subjects and by areas, which again is an important policy tool when you think about the variation between different subjects. When there is quite a lot of variation and pay isn't as easy to differentiate at all. And we also need to be thinking long term, thinking about what the strategy is to address some of this reduction in competitiveness. Non-financial attractiveness of teaching also stands out internationally for England. So this is data from the 2018 TALIS study. So generally in other OECD countries or across the world, we have high job satisfaction, not that many teachers wanting to leave, relatively low levels of stress, and a high proportion of teachers saying they have an active participation in school decisions. But for each of those, it's quite different for England in terms of being below or above in the negative direction, the OECD average, in cases being an outlier. So in terms of non-financial attractiveness, there are real issues in the England teacher workforce. Workload is the #1 factor teachers cite for why they leave. So it's important to think about workload. Workload is difficult to measure because it's more than just working hours. Working hours is a useful place to start. So this is data from the labour force survey on teachers' working hours in a typical working week. So yes, they get 13 weeks of holiday, but in a typical working week, they'll be working longer hours than people in other graduates. Very similar pattern to leaving rates, actually, suggesting there is an important relationship to the increase in first part of the decade and then have fallen before the pandemic. So yeah, there has been progress as well. So since 2016, the number of hours has fallen and has fallen across a number of different surveys. We have evidence for this for, but they remain higher than people in other professions. I mentioned that measuring workload is complex. There's also a number of different measures suggesting the same thing. Also from Department for Education surveys showed a reduction in working hours and also how teachers feel about their working hours. Same from our analysis of the labour force survey, that while things remain not as good for teachers in terms of would they prefer to work fewer hours or do they usually work evenings, there has been an improvement since 2016. Now, finally, flexible working. Flexible working is very challenging for schools. So this is data from the labour force survey. It's perhaps not surprising that close to 0% of teachers work mainly from home. I mean, the structural nature of teaching means that you have to be in the building. But when we think about the attractiveness of teaching, we're not just thinking about what's going on in teaching, but also what's going on elsewhere. Since the pandemic, there's been huge transformation in the workforce, as many of you in this room will be aware, and many of you dining in from hybrid on Teams will also be aware. Lots more people are working remotely, working from home. That used to be about 15% before the pandemic and has hugely changed since then. It's now 44%. Lots of similar graduates only working from home. So this is a real competitive challenge against teaching. What are we going to do about this? Well, increasing flexibility is one thing to look at. So there's important ways that schools can improve flexibility and make teaching more attractive and sustainable for those who desire that flexibility. But also we need to think about, well, there are limits to that, and actually how do we compensate for this going on in the labour market as a competitive challenge, and to compensate in other ways. So, to summarise, there's low teacher recruitment, rising leaving rates, and increasing vacancies, which means that there's a really intense challenge of teacher recruitment and retention. Teacher pay has lost competitiveness, which is sure is feeding into these changes. Workload has improved, but there's certainly more to do there to improve teachers' workload and to improve retention through that. And the lack of ability to work from home is a real challenge that we need to be thinking about now in terms of how we make teaching attractive relative to other options that are available to graduates. Some thoughts on some recommendations that we've been making recently on the back of this. So really need a long-term approach to teachers' pay and thinking about how much of a factor it is in improving recruitment and retention, and what is the strategy to increasing the competitiveness of teachers' pay. Need to remain focused on teachers' workload. There has been progress, but more needs to be done. And we need to understand the importance of flexible working in teachers' working practices, how those could be addressed or compensated elsewhere. So about that, and also the department has worked on a strategy several years ago. That probably needs updating given the changes in the wider workforce that have been seen in the years since, to make sure that teaching is attractive in the world in which it currently is, a post-pandemic world where things have changed and teaching needs to remain attractive. Time. So thank you very much.
Jack, that was really excellent. Thank you very much indeed. You covered a huge range of territory, and you did so on time, which I'm grateful for as well. There are lots of questions that will arise out of that, but I'm going to ask people to hold themselves back for the time being, because we're going to hear now from our other research presenters. And we now come to Emma Duchini, the assistant professor from the University of Essex. Emma is going to talk about the subject, what is the impact of academisation on teacher pay and retention and in disadvantaged schools. And we're particularly fortunate that her project outputs have only just been cleared yesterday by the ONS to discuss with you today. However, under certain conditions of security, which Emma is better qualified to describe than me. So please don't tweet all of these things out until this is properly cleared for publication, because we are lucky that they've been flexible enough to allow her to air her conclusions today. Emma, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone, my name is Emma Duchini and I'm a lecturer in the economics department of the University of Essex. And today I'm going to present you a joint work with Victor Levy from the University of Warwick, Steve Machin from the LSE, and Shiponya Telaj, who is here today from the University of Sussex. So let me say two things before starting. So the first one is that I want to thank Nuffield for the invitation and most importantly for funding our work. It has been a pleasure. It has been a pleasure to work with you. And secondly, so this is a work in progress. So I would like you to ask not to cite our results, as they're still preliminary. So I hope that we will be very happy to share our results with you in the final report that we are going to prepare in a few months. So, I imagine that the majority of you by now, almost 70% of secondary school in England are academic. However, you may not be aware of the fact that there are actually two academy models coexisting in among secondary school, with the majority of academies being called converter academies and almost 1/3 of academies, or 20% of secondary school, being so-called sponsor academies. Now, sorry, just these arrows, okay. Let me see. Maybe I can go here. Okay. Sorry for that. So what characterizes all academies is that when the school get the approval from the Department for Education to convert into an academy, the school gain autonomy from the local authorities in terms of teachers' management, structure of the school day and year, and school curriculum. However, there are two elements that are specific to sponsor academies. The first one, as the name suggests, is the fact that once a school acquires autonomy, they actually also gain support in the management of the school of a sponsor, a so-called sponsor, that it's either an educational charity or a successful business or even a university. And importantly, the vast majority of the school tend to be low-performing school, according to Ofsted, prior to the conversion. And also, if we look at the, these are also disadvantaged schools in the sense that the share of students eligible for free school meal in schools that convert into sponsor academy is 2 times higher in the school relative to the average English secondary school. So we think that there are 2 reasons, at least, to think that it is important to look at sponsor academies in the context of the teaching workforce crisis. The first one that Jack also mentioned is the fact that educational literature shows that attracting and retaining good teachers is especially challenging in disadvantaged schools. And secondly, the economic literature also shows that sponsor academy have been successful in improving students' outcomes. So what we would like to understand in our research is to what extent the changes in management of the teacher workforce have contributed to explain these success in terms of students' outcomes. So in particular, our research question is how do sponsor academies affect teachers' hiring, retention, and pay? And to answer this question, we use teacher level data from the school workforce census together with the database of teacher records over a window of time that spans the entire academization of English secondary schools. And our objective is to find the causal effect of academic, sorry for the microphone, and for this, we adopt a so-called difference in difference strategy that in a nutshell compares the evolutions of the outcome of interest in a window around the conversion year between schools that convert by a certain year that we call, for simplicity, treaty schools, and schools that convert only a few years after that we call control schools. So the very first result that we find is the fact that the conversion tend to be associated with a change in the head teachers. So in particular, what this graph shows is the difference in the probability of having a new head teacher between treated and control school in each of the year displayed here, where the 0 is the year of conversion for the treated school. So what this graph is saying is that in the year of conversion, the probability of having a new head teachers increases by more than 30 percentage points in treated schools relative to control schools. What this graph doesn't show, but that we have also found in our research, is that the new head teachers tend to be more educated and also tend to come either from an outstanding school and or a different local authority. So this is what concerns the head teachers. For what concerns teachers turnover, let's first focus on the left-hand side graph. What we find is that actually what happens basically around the conversion year is that right before the conversion, the share of teachers leaving the school is actually increasing in treated school relative to control school. And this is consistent with some teachers being skeptical about the change in management and therefore decide to leave just before the conversion taking place. However, the shares of teachers leaving the school goes back to pre-conversion levels right after the conversion takes place. At the same time, if we look at the right-hand side graph, what we see is that from the conversion years, the shares of a new hired teacher immediately increases, of course, to compensate also for the teacher who just left the school and remain higher in treaty school relative to control school in the years that follow. So if we were to look at what happens to the number of teachers, we would see that the number of teachers in treaty school relative to control school falls just before the conversion and then goes back to pre-conversion level in treated school relative to control school. But what is actually interesting is that this follows the pattern of pupils number, in the sense that also pupil number were on a downward trend before the introduction, the conversion into academies, and then went back after the conversion. So then what we also find, and what is actually quite important to understand the conversion into academies, is that this effect into teacher turnover translated to an important change in the composition of teachers that tend to be become younger, more likely to be high achiever in school. And also for those teachers that come from a different school, they also tend to come from an outstanding school or for another local authority. In terms of teachers' pay, instead, what we find is an interesting finding that the overall gross pay doesn't seem to change in these schools after conversion, but what happens is that there is a shift away from additional payment, such as teaching and learning responsibility, towards using more the base pay to remunerate teachers. And we also find that by the end of the period, we see that pay disputes experienced teachers tend to increase a bit. So just to conclude, I won't repeat exactly what we have found, but I also want to tell you that we are currently working to extend the time framework over which we analyze the result to understand the medium long-term dynamics, and also importantly estimating the spillover effect in terms of teachers' outcome in non-academy schools. And then if I were to think about the potential implication of our result, as I said, stressing that these are still preliminary results, I would say that what these results suggest is that the school management is key to attract high-quality teachers and improve student outcome. But I'm happy to discuss more about this as a potential implication of our result. Thank you.
Emma, that was fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. Really interesting presentation and raises lots of interesting follow-up questions, both for you and for us here today, I suspect. And thanks to colleagues at the ONS for their generosity in allowing you to discuss this today and their flexibility. So I'm now going to come to the third presentation, which is from Bernardita Munoz-Chereau, who is lecturer at University College London, and who's recently completed a project looking at the issue of how negative Ofsted grades affect the teacher workforce. Bernie.
Before I let Bernie to the microphone, please could I say to the online colleagues who have joined us, if you're having problems with the sound, every time anyone posts a question, you get a ping, which you could probably hear actually back online. Wondering if you could hold off a bit. So much. Research project funded by the Nuffield Foundation. How does receiving a negative Ofsted grade affect the teacher workforce? I'm Bernardita Munoz-Chereau, and I'm presenting this work that was we worked together with Joe Hutchinson from EPI and with Professor Melanie. So first, we start looking at the literature review and thinking, what does the literature say about receiving a negative Ofsted grade? And we found that in the literature that receiving a negative Ofsted grade or less than good grade works like a ladder. Because some studies have found that they help improving the schools, acting as a catalyst for change and speeding recovery, providing tough penalties for those schools that don't comply, or providing external pressure and support. Some other research also show that receiving a less than good grade does not help the school to improve. That's the opposite. It helps decline by lowering teacher morale and increasing feelings of importance, by increasing teacher mobility, stress and burnout, by awakening school ethos and morale, and by narrowing the curriculum to focus on tested subjects at the expense of other subjects and activities. So the question we are answering today is, how does consistently receiving a negative Ofsted grade affect the This means that our study, which is a mixed method study, was focusing on a sample of 580 primary and secondary schools that received 3 consecutive less than good Ofsted grades. So here we are not talking about just receiving one this Ofsted grade, but persistently receiving this, which Ofsted coined as stuck schools. This extended for more than 13 years, the data we are looking at. So we did secondary analysis, first quantitatively of Ofsted management information, school performance, value-added progress, and pupil demographics. School work, we look at the school workforce teacher data, the census, school governance and local data through get information about schools, PFE, academy, and sponsor pipeline, and school finance data for income and expenditure. And we conducted propensity score matching, cluster analysis, and path analysis. And then we conducted 16 case studies in stuck schools and their comparisons, where we conducted interviews and focus groups to understand the perspective of teachers, head teachers, governors about their inspection trajectory and their views on this. So looking at our results, first I'm going to present the quantitative results. And through path analysis, we found two negative cycles that indirectly increased teacher turnover. First, it was through pupil intake. So receiving a low inspection grade then led to pupil intake becoming more deprived, which then led to teachers' turnover increases, which then was associated with more less than good grades. Here it's important to say that this path analysis is not a causal analysis, but allow us to show what comes first. So we can see this path and see a specific trajectory. The second negative cycle that we found in these stuck schools is that receiving a low inspection grade was then associated with changes of the head teacher, which then was associated with teacher turnover increasing, and then again receiving subsequent below good Ofsted grades. But we also found a positive cycle, which was that after receiving a low inspection grade, when the schools joined a MAT, we saw that the teacher turnover decreased. And this was then associated with subsequent inspections grades that were better. But this was only the case in secondary schools. We didn't see this same cycle happening in primary schools. Now, thinking about the qualitative results, overall, the stakeholders described too much change, too many inspections, and instability in the workforce. So these case study schools have been reorganized, converted into different academies, up to 3 times into different schools. And this made it difficult for stakeholders to feel accountable for what they described as the legacy of their inspection results. They say we already changed. We have 3 different head teachers. This is a different school from what we're talking about. So they didn't feel like these results were something that they could feel accountable for. Also, they described that they were receiving too frequent Section 5, which is the overall inspection, but also Section 8 or monitoring inspections. And in the 16 schools, we found that some of them have received in the 13 years 3 full inspections, but others 16, comparing the monitoring and the full inspection. And this has to do with the design of inspection frequencies has to do with the quality of the school. If the school is perceived to go low, there will be more frequency. But this was perceived as too much. I will let you read the quote. That was a head teacher of a stuck schools in the Northwest. And overall, in the case studies, we also saw that receiving more than consistently low Ofsted grades generated a reputational damage. So the idea is that it's making more difficult to improve. So this reputational damage works as a slippery slope, as case study schools describe how the student morale, the identity, the recruitment, parental trust, everything became more difficult. These schools didn't thought that Ofsted was the cause, but that receiving this grade made challenges even more challenging. Then I will let you read the view of one head teacher in the Southwest. So, wrapping up, what were the policy recommendations we introduced thinking about these specific schools? So the first one is ensure that inspectors are properly trained to understand the significance and implications of schools working in very challenging circumstances, and the positive role that they can play to support schools in their improvement journey. I said these schools didn't have necessarily a negative view on Ofsted, but there were a lot of difference. So in some cases, the support or the idea that they were really understanding the context where they were working made a huge difference. We also suggest to consider other positive support that can be given to stuck schools to assist in their improvement journey, including linking them with schools that have been unstuck, on schools that after these 13 years did receive a good grade. But these schools are not nationally represented, or they are not linked necessarily with these stuck schools. Revise the cycle of full Section 5 inspections and monitoring inspections in order to give time to implement change, but avoid transforming monitoring into too frequent inspections or over surveillance. Avoid too much variation in the number of inspections and across inspectors, and avoid also provide false hope on monitoring inspections. So we saw that many times the monitoring inspection said, yeah, you're doing really good. We can see a lot of potential for being a good now. And then a new inspector may come and then they go again inadequate, wouldn't really improve. And for these schools, considering removing the overall grades to avoid this detrimental effect that a series of negative Ofsted grades is having on school improvement. So overall, is this sense that too much change does not necessarily translate into improvement or what they need to support. So it's really thinking about what is the intervention that these schools can have, and so making that distinction between change and improvement.
Bernie, that was great and really clear. Thank you very much indeed for your presentation and for bringing out some of the policy issues from that. We now come to the fourth and final presentation by Professor John Jerrim of UCL, who's going to talk about the issue of teacher health and well-being. John.
Yes, so thank you. Thank you all very much for the invite to be here. We're just presenting 10 graphs about teacher well-being, covering a mix of topics. So delving straight into it, one of the first things we did in our Foundation project was compare mental health and well-being of teachers in England to the well-being of teachers in other countries. First of all, we did this comparing to other teachers elsewhere in the UK. This is a graph showing the percentage of teachers with high levels of anxiety, dissatisfaction in life, whether they feel worthwhile in life. And as you can see, there is some variation across the UK, but it's actually not that big. You take anxiety, for instance, to begin with. England and Wales look pretty similar. Scotland a little bit lower. Northern Ireland quite a bit lower, but the sample size in Northern Ireland is small, so I wouldn't pay too much attention to that. Overall, we basically found a bit of difference, but not that much. So really, the well-being of teachers in England seems to be pretty like that elsewhere, teachers elsewhere in the UK. We then took a broader international perspective. Jack kind of stole my thunder earlier with this point. It uses TALIS 2018 data. And this is teachers very much reporting about what they feel about their job. So there are questions such as, do they feel the stress at work? Comes from the horizontal axis here. Vertical axis is the percentage of teachers looking at their job impact on mental health. There's a fair bit of cross-country variation. Key point, I guess, for this audience is England seems to be higher on these two metrics than most other OECD and non-OECD countries, across about 40 different comparators. What do teachers point towards in England as being the drivers of low levels of well-being in their job? Well, as part of the TALIS 2018 survey, they were asked about various aspects of their job which caused them stress. And two of the things that stood out in England compared to other countries was marking and accountability. So running along the horizontal axis here, is the percentage of teachers who said they felt stressed by marking. Vertical axis is the sense they felt stressed by being held accountable for achievement. And again, you can see England being in the northeast of this kind of diagram here, showing actually higher than in most other countries that participated study. What are the correlates or things that associate with higher levels of workload stress? Well, perhaps the most obvious factor is workload. When teachers ended up feeling that their workload was more manageable, they felt less stressed. Well, that's probably not a surprise to anyone. But over and above that, supportive leadership also associates with lower levels of stress. What didn't seem to be as important, or the other workplace factors didn't seem to be pretty much correlation at all, was the amount of collaboration there was between staff, how prepared teachers felt for their kind of teaching assignments, and also the kind of level of behaviour in school. So it really seemed to be kind of related to workload and leadership. So the previous graphs have basically shown you what teachers say they kind of felt about their job when asked very directly about work as a teacher. The next few graphs are more about their well-being and how they felt in general in their lives. So there's a difference here, right? They're not being asked specifically about how stressed you feel at work. They're asked things like, how anxious are you? What we do in this graph is present the percentage of teachers who are, for instance, very unhappy in life, reporting that they feel anxious. We compare teachers in England to all other professional groups. So each of the dots on this graph represent one other occupation. And then the dashed vertical and horizontal lines illustrate the cross-occupation average. So it's a bad thing in these graphs to be in the north east quadrant. It's a good thing to be in the southwest quadrant. What you can see when we look at anxiety and anxiousness, teachers are pretty much bang in the middle of this graph, right? Actually, teachers don't stand out from other groups or other occupations in terms of their general levels of happiness and anxiety. And it's very similar on the right-hand graph. In fact, if anything, the situation seems to be slightly better for teachers in terms of their self-worth. Again, pretty similar to the cross-occupation average in terms of life satisfaction. This was data we drew from an annual population survey between 2011 and 2018. But within the academic paper we wrote on this, we replicated this 11 different data. Showed a very similar pattern of polls across each of them. So actually, teaching doesn't seem to stand out as having low levels of well-being compared to other professions. What we also did as part of the project was taking kind of a long-term perspective over time. So we used information from the local survey to look at the percentage of teachers and other occupational groups that reported having a long-lasting mental health issue, late 1990s and up to 2018. So the bright pink line in this graph illustrates the trajectory for teachers, and what you can see is that there's been a big increase over time. Late 1990s, there's almost no one reporting having a lasting mental health issue. That's kind of gone up to around 6%. Data point we had in the data series 2015. However, this isn't something that's just unique to teaching, right? See here the pattern for other education, for other occupational groups, and a very similar pattern has been observed for other occupations as well. So yes, there's more teachers now reporting mental health issues from last week previously, but this is true also in other occupations. There's various ways you can interpret this evidence in this graph. Is this essentially a good thing? It may sound strange to say, but it could be. Is this just a reporting issue? If we go back to look at the measures of anxiety and happiness, dissatisfaction and low self-worth between 2011 and 2018, get this picture. Things have been absolutely flat. There's no change really at school in this period amongst teachers. Despite this coinciding with, during this period, this being a big increase in reporting long-lasting mental health issues. So it could be that actually things in reality haven't changed, right, in terms of feeling unhappy and more anxious. It's just people are reporting it more. And that could actually be a good thing. That's the kind of difference between the narrative we often get. We also, as part of the project, looked at the mental health of early career teachers. In particular, how they were working in their mental health as they started working as a teacher versus to before they went. So this was a small sample, it was only about 300 teachers, but we had some information they reported on their mental health at age 6 when they're working as in the first few years as a teacher, but also back when they were age 17, so they took A-levels and whatever. And you can see actually things were very stable, or pretty stable across these 2 time points. So when they were working as teachers, they were just as likely to say they felt reasonably unhappy or were losing confidence, sorry over sleep. It wasn't particularly higher than previously. And again, we compared teachers in this respect to other professional groups, and the pattern was very similar. So again, there didn't seem to be anything that stood out about teachers in the early stages of their career compared to patients. Now, almost everything I've shown you so far, has been from prior to the pandemic. So what happened to teachers' feelings or anxiety about work during the pandemic? One of the things that happened during the pandemic was that it mucked up one of our ideas that we were pursuing as part of our Nuffield Foundation work, and that was to investigate how the mental health and well-being of teachers, anxiety in particular, varied over the course of a year. But what it did do meant we had some good measures going through the pandemic of their anxiety. So in this graph, I'm showing you data collected at 75 time points during the pandemic of the percentage of teachers reporting a high level of anxiety in the workplace. And what you can see basically is, other than a couple of notable peaks, actually things were pretty flat. So when the pandemic first hit in March 2020, there was a peak of teachers. And when January 2021 hit, where kind of the government was doing the hokey cokey about whether schools would open or close, or open or close, or open or close or not, that anxiety peaked. But outside of that, things were kind of pretty stable compared to the pre-pandemic period. To conclude, though, for head teachers, which is the yellow bar here. So again, before the pandemic hit, teachers and head teachers reported very similar levels of work-related anxiety. During the pandemic, it went up, particularly amongst head teachers, with lots of spikes, particularly during sorry, I speeded through those last ones, but I was having a signal to. The next thing was a curtain. I'll stop it there.
John, thanks very much indeed. That was another really fascinating, meaty presentation. Can I invite the 4 panelists to come up to the front to these chairs for the Q&A, where they're going to grapple with another microphone and make sure that they each are holding it before they speak so that everybody online can hear. Yeah, if you don't mind coming up here now, thanks very much. Our three expert panelists will no doubt want to pick up some of those issues in their comments in a moment. But before that, we've got 20 minutes for any questions. I'd like to really try to keep them to the focus of the four research projects that we've heard about and try to focus on those. And then we'll go wider when we talk to the three panelists and have their Q&A session. Jenny from Nuffield is somewhere in the building, I think not on this floor, but below, carefully monitoring all the online questions. So I'm going to go to the online questions through Jenny first, if that's okay. And then I'm going to come to those of you in the room to ask questions. Sadly, because there's such fantastic presentations, we've got to keep this to 20 minutes. That means that we've got to be quite disciplined in short questions, and I fear as well, panelists, reasonably short answers. So thank you very much for that. Do make sure you've all got the microphone when you respond. And Jenny, we go over to you for some questions that have come in online.
So we've had two questions come in online so far. So one attendee has asked a question for Jackworth. So when you compared some graduates to teachers, which industries were you comparing to teachers?
Good question. So it's we previously measured. It's hard to know what to compare teachers to. Basically, is the fundamental problem. We've previously used all professional occupations, which is what teaching is classed as a professional occupation. So everything in that kind of bucket of teaching of professional occupations, which might be lawyers, journalists, nurses, all sorts of engineers and different occupations. But then when I say similar, what I mean is we've made sure that the gender, age, region, and qualification, basically they've all got a degree, distribution is the same across. So it's not being driven by that, but there's a comparison. What we switched to doing this year is to look at graduates. A lot of the findings and the results are really quite similar, but just to look at those with a degree and again do that matching so that we're comparing to something. It's very difficult. John's probably found the same with trying to compare. Like, what do you compare a teacher to? Like, nurses are different in lots of ways. Police officers are different in lots of ways. People in the private sector are very different in lots of different ways. So we're just trying to find a useful benchmark. And a lot of the stuff that sits behind this analysis is looking at kind of different ways of doing it and actually making sure that it's not just because of the quirky way you've decided to do it that way, and that it's robust to different things. So hopefully that's a satisfactory answer.
Thanks, Jack. Jenny, have you got any others for us?
We've had quite a few new ones come in. So sorry to those online if there isn't time to answer all of these questions. So one from Ian Horswell, which is, did Ofsted judgments have varying effects on teachers depending on subject specialism?
Try that. I'm not sure whether the research covered it or not, but
no, we didn't work there, but what really reflect what Jack was saying, that the head teachers were finding extremely difficult to find well-trained teachers. Most of the teachers were very young. Most of them that started their initial teacher training remained in the school, and they had to take lots of strategies. For example, mixing year 1 and year 2 into one classroom. So putting a lot of demands on teachers to cope with reducing number of students. So make it in order to make the school viable, they made a lot of very creative interventions, but they put a lot of stress on specialists and general teachers.
Thank you, Bernie. Jenny, should we take a couple more of yours?
Yes, so we've got another question from Tanya Gledo, who says, can I ask Jack or any of the others what they see as a way of balancing work from home or lack thereof for teachers?
Okay. You'll be handed the mic on
that. I think it's very difficult. I think you shouldn't kid ourselves by thinking that it's going to be,
we just need to react by teachers working from home 3 days a week. That's very unlikely to happen. I think I just put that provocation and that challenge because, you know, when you're thinking about graduates who are thinking about coming into teaching or going into something else, that will be a part of their factor in their decision making. And of course, there's lots of other different things. There's lots of positive reasons for going into teaching as well as other things. So it's just about thinking that as one factor about the whole package about the attractiveness of teaching, and just making sure the whole thing stacks up. Because if that one thing changes and becomes less attractive, then the whole profession becomes less attractive, and you have to compensate in other ways. Otherwise, it's going to be much more difficult to attract and retain those teachers. I mean, longer term, we could think about what more flexible teaching might look like. I think we have to start with the easy things like, well, the relatively easy things like making sure everyone, all teachers who would like to work part-time have the opportunity to put in that request in a useful time that makes it manageable for the school and enables time for negotiation. And other things like PPA, doing PPA from home, which is somewhat prevalent in primary schools, but almost non-existent in secondary schools. Thinking about some of these smaller wins in terms of flexibility, I think, is important, even if it isn't going to quite match what's going on in the rest of the labour market.
Jack, thanks very much indeed. And that issue about sort of working from home and so forth might be one that Patrick and the panelists want to pick up in their comments later on if they've got time. Jenny, did you have one more, and then I'll come to the room?
Yeah, so there are quite a few more, so I'll just choose one. Sorry to those that haven't been in time for. So Dawn Horton asks, question for John. The data show the difference between teachers and head teachers. Has any work been done to explore the wellbeing of teachers who have a pastoral support remit? I was a teacher 25 years, but during that time a guidance teacher and eventually deputy head teacher with a child protection and multi-agency remit. Very different stresses to marking, so I'm interested to see if those differences are being measured.
Thanks.
So I'm not sure if this was in relation to the final graph that I showed, but that was very much during the pandemic, right? Where obviously leaders were under particular kind of stresses and strains around kind of school reopening, whatever, testing. And whether that holds more generally now, I think, is something that we probably need to look at again. As part of TALIS in 2018, they did ask separate questions to teachers and head teachers about their kind of various parts of their stresses. I can't quite remember what that showed off the top of my head.
Great, thanks very much, Jenny. I might come back to you if we've got time, so don't hold back from some of those other questions that might have come in, but I'll just come to the room now. I saw John at the back and then the two ladies in the second row.
Thank you very much, Jack. You didn't have time to mention everything, so you didn't really talk about place in terms of this. I wonder, in the context of the market review and the possibility that the department might add in unfilled vacancies into the teacher supply model each year, whether you think that might have any implications, and also whether in terms of retention, whether you've done any work in relation to whether there are any differences between the state sector and the private sector, because that would particularly affect some parts of the country. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Do you want to take that, Jack? I might then take a couple of questions together just to...
Yeah, the importance of place gives me a really good opportunity to plug the data dashboard that we produced as part of the Nuffield project that we've just completed. There's lots of data there about attrition rates and turnover rates and supply teacher spending, all broken up by different geographical areas. I mean, one of the things, just trying to look through that and look for patterns, is actually the difficulty of finding patterns. And I know this is something the Department for Education's found as well. You know, there isn't a kind of consistent, you know, we just need to work on these 5 areas. It's a very mixed picture of different challenges right across the country. But yeah, I think place is important. Place is likely to become important in terms of the ITT market landscape. So definitely something to think about in the coming years as that hits the road in the autumn this year. And yeah, to your question about private schools, I mean, the data for private schools isn't anywhere as good as the state schools, so it's very difficult to compare and contrast. But yeah, we need to Also, bear in mind that state schools are in an environment with other types of school out there, as well as England being in the UK with lots of opportunities to work in other countries, Wales, Scotland, etc.
Thanks very much. I'm going to take the 2 questions in the second row. Then there's a lady in the 5th row and a gentleman in whatever. I can't do all the counting quickly enough. And then if we've got time, I'll go back to Jenny. If we take those 2 questions together.
Sure. Good morning. I'm Heather from the Education Endowment Foundation. Thank you for really interesting presentations this morning. And my question relates to potentially something that may have been out of scope, but I haven't heard any mention of specifically the early years sector. So I'm curious if any of your projects or research looked at some of these challenges as related to that sector and where there might be similarities or differences. Thanks.
Thanks very much. There was a second question, I think.
Hiya, hi, I'm Matilda from TES. I was just wondering, obviously, loads of really, really interesting things all adding together in terms of attrition, retention, recruitment. Do you think there's enough urgency at the moment within government in addressing these things? And what do you think the repercussions of perhaps a lack of acknowledgement of all these different factors could bring?
Great, thank you very much. And then I'll go to the lady in the 5th row. Thanks very much. Who wants to take those 2, or one of them at least?
My name's Celia Hoyles. I'm UCL Institute of Education. Thank you for these very good presentations. I'm particularly interested in my area is maths. It's something that Jack sent, which was about the increase in deployment of non-specialist maths or teachers. And this has been a real bug for mathematics for ages, which has, I think, serious implications for stress, for attainment. And I just wondered if other people have noticed this in their research. Because okay, you do need a teacher in front of a class, but if you're employing, say, a non-specialist teacher teaching maths in secondary schools, there are grave implications for the future of the mathematical future of their students. I think we know this from years of other research. So I just like the panel to comment on this and well, maybe later we can think about what we might do with it, but that's a big question. Thank you.
Thanks. Since we're almost there, I'll take the gentleman's question and then I'll ask the panel to respond to those 4 as seems sensible.
Hello, I'll try and be quick. Francis Green from UCL. I'd like to ask a question about this comparison with other professions, probably John's. Our research shows that when you look at job quality, not just at wages, sorry, I need to speak louder or closer to this. Our research says that job quality in other domains, not just wages, has been declining for teachers since at least 2012. And the gap, if you like, between teachers and other professionals or whatever your comparator is, seems to be widening and has particularly widened over the pandemic because, as Jack very ably showed, the issue of not being able to work at home, structurally not being able to work at home, has prevented any improvement for teachers, but actually for these other professionals, they're pretty well all registering an increase in job quality in a number of different domains. This is as yet unpublished research, but we're coming out with it very soon. So what seems to have been happening is that the gap seems to be widening and then suddenly widening again because of the pandemic. My question is, what do you think of that? Because it seems to me different from the general tenor of what you were saying, John.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed for those questions.
Yeah, I'll take that kind of question first of all, and I'll come to the one just beforehand. So on that particular point, I think there's different ways that you can interpret the evidence that I presented. One is there's always this problem known as in the literature as survivor bias, right? So who are we measuring when we see these kind of people? It's the teachers who remain in the profession, right? So it could be that those who felt more anxious or whatever have already dropped out, and so we're no longer measuring them in the data set as teachers. So that's one kind of possible interpretation of that. The second is, remember that those questions were very much about well-being in general life. So it may not have that strong a spillover between, for instance, the workplace and more generally
about how people are feeling. So there's different ways that you can interpret those kind of pieces of evidence. Coming back to the point about mathematics teachers, I completely agree. And one of the big problems, particularly for mathematics and physics, which Jack also highlighted, is the attractiveness of outside options. So for people with strong mathematics skills, strong science skills, they do have good options to take jobs elsewhere, which, guess what? I get paid more and I can work from home pretty much when I want. So those outside attractiveness factors of our occupations will differ across different subjects. Where that takes you, and this is probably going to be something controversial and what the panelists might want to pick up on, is what's the solution to that? Well, Jack was speaking about, well, we need to compensate more. We need to compensate more because you can't work from home or whatever. But then that takes you to differential compensation for teachers in different subjects. So that might be something to pick up on. And I might run away after that.
Okay. Emma, would you like to pick up on any of the questions that came through? I know not all of them are precisely in the area that you covered.
Yeah. So definitely, these are very interesting questions. They're not very specific to what I'm doing, but I think that these how to pay teachers and whether to differentiate teachers in terms of their pay and the pay structure is definitely a topic that I think there's need to be more discussion about, precisely because also outside options are quite different across subjects. So I think that there should definitely be a discussion about this, and we touch a bit on that with the academies, in the sense that we see that academies are where we see that pay dispersion is increasing across teachers that are equally experienced, suggests that academies are using a bit of their discretion in paying teachers. Whether this is good or bad, I think it's still an open question, but it definitely is something we are interested in exploring in our research, yes.
Great, thank you very much. I might hold the other two back because I just want to see if I can squeeze out the 5 minutes that I'm allowed to wrap up the session at the end, which I don't need, to squeeze two more questions from Jenny in. And then we will need to finish this bit to go on to the expert panel that we must make sure we've got adequate time for. So Jenny, have you got two more for us?
I do. So Michelle Fuller asks, what are the key factors that might positively impact on teacher wellbeing and retention in England within the short term, considering the conditions of work for teachers, such as salary?
Okay, who wants to take that one? Bernie, do you want to say anything? It does touch a bit on your project, I suppose.
So for these teachers that are and head teachers that are working in very disadvantaged contexts, they are there also for a moral purpose. They are making a difference into the life of their children. That's the reason that really keeps them working there. A recognition of that, for example, by looking at the value added they're adding, etc. By looking at, because all the stack schools are not, some of them have progressed academically, but this is lost in the overall description of the quality of the school. So a recognition of their role in terms of all the things that a teacher does, it will be an incredible, important aspect in disadvantaged schools.
Thank you, Jenny. Jenny, one more.
So another question from James Shea is, do we think that the definition for wellbeing itself has shifted, especially following the pandemic, and so more teachers now see teaching as damaging to their mental and physical health?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I don't think we have the high enough quality data yet post-pandemic to be able to say actually what's happening on the ground now and how really it may or may not has shifted following the pandemic. My hunch is that it will look pretty similar to what we saw previously, but that's a hypothesis, not evidence-based at the moment.
Great. And last but not least, I'm just going to abuse my position as chair to ask one question about slides which did cause gasps amongst the audience, which were Jack's on teacher pay, and particularly the record of the UK versus other countries. I suppose if you're DFE, you might say, yes, that looks a bit embarrassing and it's a bit uncomfortable, but actually what matters for recruitment is your competitiveness with other similar professions. And actually, teaching looked as if it was doing just as badly as other similar professions until the last couple of years, where the other professions have improved and teaching has continued to go down. Is that true? I mean, is teaching broadly competitive with other professions until recently, but really not in the last 2 years? Or is there a bigger problem that teaching is not competitive with professions over a longer period?
So some of the research we've been doing over the last few years is to look at what teachers do after they leave teaching. So we can use longitudinal household surveys to identify a load of teachers and see what they do next. And we recently used the annual survey of hours and earnings, which goes back a long time to be able to look at this. And actually, remarkably few teachers go into other professions. So, I mean, it goes back to this question about benchmarking, kind of what are we comparing to? And actually, teachers go into a whole range of other professions. So I think I'm more leaning towards the kind of, well, average earnings matters. And actually, the increase in average earnings since 2010 has been higher than it has been for other professions. So it matters outside of other professions how competitive teaching is. But also teaching has lost competitiveness compared to those other professions and other graduate occupations. So there has been a gap opened up, which is undoubtedly feeding into that attractiveness and difficulty recruiting and retaining. But also, that chart does create gasps, but it's the change since 2010. And actually, if you look at the TALIS data, there's a measure that says, are you satisfied with your level of pay? And actually, teachers broadly are, and actually in England are slightly above the OECD average. So there is a question about what are we trying to tackle here to deal with these challenges. I think from the OECD data, what stands out is the non-financial stuff. But if we're going to ask teachers to do all of the things that are associated with high stress, wanting to leave, and not having much say over what they do, then we have to pay teachers to compensate for that and to look at that.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed. And can I, on your behalf, thank all of the panelists for great presentations this morning. If it's okay, could I ask you to go back to your old seats, if I can put it that way, to make way for the three expert panelists that we have now got. And a great link, I think, with the last issue that we were discussing is provided by our first speaker, Patrick Roach, who we're delighted to have here today, who's General Secretary of NASUWT, one of the largest education unions in the country. We've asked Patrick to talk about the issue of how the pay and working conditions of teachers need to change to shore up the profession. And I'll just remind Patrick that, and the other speakers, that there is a journalist from the Times Educational Supplement here today. So everything we say is on the record unless you choose to ask for it not to be.
So everything I say may be taken down and used in every. You know, I might have heard that one elsewhere. But anyway. Thank you, David, and thanks very much for the kind invitation to be here today. You'll probably all be relieved. Slides, focus on me and my words. How can the pay and working conditions of teachers change, shore up the profession for the future? Well, that's the question I'm being asked. I'm not sure that's the right question. The evidence is that we need to do more than merely shore up the system or shore up the profession. In fact, we need to be much more ambitious for the teaching profession. We need to set out our sights higher than simply shoring up a system. It would effectively mean cementing in failure. That's not a position that we want to be in. Okay, well, clearly that's not good enough. You know, I do use my classroom voice often when I'm addressing crowds like this. But we need to be more ambitious than merely shoring up. We need to radically improve the quality of our system so that we can recruit and retain the teachers that we need. And let's start by recognising that actually, as other speakers have said, pay and conditions do matter. Yes, teachers do come into the profession because they want to make a difference. They have a moral and ethical purpose. Teaching is often described as being a vocation. But you know what? Pay and working conditions do matter as much as the career structure and opportunities to progress in your career also matter to our members. And that should be clear, especially now, given that we have the very real prospect of widespread industrial action in our schools. Perhaps the elephant in the room, I don't know. But my union, the NSWT, and other unions are currently balloting our members for industrial action on pay, on workload, and on working hours. Now, I say that not to make a cheap point, but to say this, that actually industrial action isn't inevitable. But it does require commitment. It requires political will to sit down, to work with unions, to work with the profession, to bring about the systemic structural changes that are needed to address the scale of the crisis that we have. And unfortunately, at the present time, we have an education secretary that is refusing to sit down and work with us to find a resolution. You know, I've heard from Gillian Keegan's own mouth that great teachers made a world of difference to her in her life. And no one forgets a good teacher. My concern is that too many, including the Education Secretary, have forgotten not a good teacher, but that they need to pay teachers well and they need to treat teachers well. The current teacher supply crisis was no accident. It wasn't planned, but also it wasn't inevitable either. It's the product of a decade of underinvestment in the teaching profession and in our school system in general. A product of underinvestment which has left schools and children's services woefully underfunded and contributed to driving down levels of pay, which is impacting adversely on teacher morale, as well as eroding teachers' pay and conditions. A lot more I could say about morale, but I think other speakers may cover that topic much more admirably than myself. But it's also made the job of teaching and leadership in our schools increasingly unattractive and workload intensive at the same time. We have the dysfunctionality of inspection and accountability, including within school accountabilities, such as performance-related pay, which also needs to be addressed. So there has to be a recognition that the direction of travel that's been set by government, frankly, is wrong, and it's not working. The consequences on workload for teachers, the consequences on morale of teachers have been profound. Now, I do know that we are pushed for time, and I'm hoping that we'll have more space for questions so we can address some of those issues. Well, why do I say what I say about pay, about workload, and about the well-being of the profession? What is the basis on which I cite those assertions? Well, actually, the basis is our members, the teaching profession, teachers and school leaders, the length and breadth of the country, who tell me directly in audiences like this, but who also tell us through our own systematic research, which we've been doing over the course of the last decade and more. They tell us about the scale and the depth of the crisis which is impacting on the profession. Now, we have a government that says that we've got nothing to worry about. We've got record numbers of people coming into the profession. They'll also claim that they're doing everything possible, including bursaries and now new incentives to recruit overseas trained teachers to come to work in the UK. But the reality is, if we're going to keep those new entrants through bursaries, if we're going to keep those overseas trained teachers in the profession, then we have to address the underpinning issues that are driving teachers out of the profession in the first instance. And that is uncompetitive pay, which has already been mentioned, unsustainable workload, and long working hours. So it's a crisis that requires a systemic set of solutions and political will to deliver. So what are those solutions? Well, I'm just going to skip over some of them. We could do with a national workforce plan, and one that's been developed with the profession. That'd help. I haven't seen much evidence of that. We could do with a cross-government commitment, and I do mean cross-government, not just in the DFE, but a cross-government commitment to investment in education recovery and renewal, dealing with the legacy of the pandemic and applying the lessons that actually we've already learned about how underprepared we were as a country for that pandemic. And the legacy of all of that is being played out today in schools. We need national targets to reduce average working time of teachers and head teachers. We need to end the culture of the long working hours, and that means transforming the teacher's contract and removing the open-ended expectation that teachers should work as long as it takes to get the job done. And by the way, we could spend a lot of time talking about home working and hybrid working, and I know Jack said a lot about that. Teachers do an awful lot of home working right now. That's how they get the job done in the first place. So let's not kid ourselves with distractions about home working and hybrid working. Let's identify what is the scale and the scope of the job that teachers should be asked to do. And let's make sure that schools are properly resourced to meet the expectations that are placed upon them. We need that independent review, by the way, of Ofsted and the accountability system. I mean, some changes announced this week. Well, your jury's out on that one, perhaps. But the reality is that we have an accountability system which is driving excessive workload, and we need system leadership that demonstrates best practice. Of course, we need teachers paid well, and that means a commitment to real terms pay and pay restoration, and it means a national framework of teachers' pay, which actually ensures that teachers, wherever they teach, are properly and consistently rewarded for the job that they're doing. And also, whilst I'm at it, that we address the issues not only of inconsistency, but discrimination in the pay system, which operates to the detriment of women, of Black and Asian teachers, and of teachers who are disabled. We think there are solutions out there. There are solutions that can be found. It requires the political will to deliver them. And I say this again to Gillian Keegan, we stand ready anytime, any place, anywhere to work on those solutions with you. Thanks very much, David.
Patrick, thank you very much for covering so much territory in a short period of time, and do join me up here for the question session. We now come to our second panelist, our expert panelist, Melanie Renowden, who is the CEO of the new National Institute of Teaching, and who we've invited to speak for 5 minutes on how can teacher training and development address future challenges. Melanie, over to you.
Thank you very much, David. We're back on this mic. We'll see how this goes. So I'm delighted to be with you. Sorry. Oh, right. Didn't go very well.
I think it's the mic. It's not you.
Oh, right. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Hopefully this works smoothly. Thank you very much. Thank you, David. Thank you very much, Nuffield, for inviting me to join you. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm Melanie. I'm the Chief Executive of the National Institute of Teaching. If you haven't come across us yet, that might be because actually we're quite new. We've been established now for just coming up to a year. And really our focus is on finding the answer to the question really that Nuffield have posed for me today, which is how can we do the best possible job of preparing and training our teachers and leaders. So that's the challenge that the National Institute exists to respond to. And it's also, coincidentally, the question that I've been asked to address today. So I've been listening really intently, actually, to all of the contributions from the researchers that we had earlier on, and of course, fellow panelists as well. That's going to be very useful to inform our work. So to define challenges for the purpose of today, I am thinking about teacher recruitment, yes, and retention, but also, really importantly, of course, teacher quality. And that's because we know that teacher quality is the single most important in-school factor in terms of the effect it has on children's outcomes, and particularly the disproportionately positive benefit that that delivers for children facing the greatest level of disadvantage. So yes, recruitment, retention, but also, importantly, teacher quality as well. So I'm going to start with what I hope is some good news. as an education community, we have made important steps forward in the structured, systematic and evidence-informed development that's available to teachers and leaders right across the country. We've joined career-long development up in a way that boosts coherence, both for the individual as they progress through their teaching and perhaps leadership career, but also for schools, so that when they have members of staff who are engaged in programs across different facets of professional development, they're able to join them up. And the hope is that that then goes on to deliver a boost in impact as well that can be seen in positive impact on outcomes for children as well. So I do think that there is some positivity to recognise and to build upon. It's early days, there's certainly more to do to improve, but the foundations, I think, are solid. And that matters in a couple of ways. It matters because we're developing school leaders so that they are equipped to set the conditions and deploy the practices in schools so that great teaching can happen. And that in turn, of course, plays a role in attracting and retaining staff. And one of John's slides from earlier on, in fact, talks about the effect size of leadership and how that's experienced by teaching staff. So it matters in terms of school leadership, but of course it also matters for the individual as well, where being in a consistent, supportive and positive culture of development, it improves efficacy, so those teachers get better at their jobs, and being better at your job helps you to feel better about what you do and in turn contributes to retention as well and satisfaction in role. So just last week, I'm sure lots of people saw it, the Education Endowment Foundation published a new literature review on this topic, and their report, I was really pleased to see, reinforced the importance of our focus on professional development as a solution to challenges with recruitment and retention. And so I saw in the Education Endowment Foundation report that they were talking about workload reduction, induction, staff induction, professional development, and the quality of school leadership as all having the potential to deliver improvements. So we really should be looking at professional development, not just as another thing we need to do alongside all the challenges we've been talking about today, but as one of the tools that we have in tackling these challenges as well. However, it is worth noting in the EEF report and more widely that we're really reliant on international evidence because the English evidence base actually is really slight. And this is one of the challenges that the National Institute of Teaching has been set up to address. So we're going to be making it a priority to fill in some of these knowledge gaps, and there are really important gaps that we need to tackle there as well. So hopefully you accept that teacher development is a really vital ingredient in both teacher quality and in teacher supply. So then what is getting in the way of the impact of professional development? Well, fundamentally, I would say it comes down to teacher time. It is the most precious raw material that we have. It's water in the desert. We don't have enough of it. And we strongly suspect that too much of it is being squandered on low value tasks and even on ineffective interventions. So time being spent on things that maybe even take us backwards and not forwards. So the relationship between teacher workload and retention means that we need to know that time that's being spent on professional development is being used well, on professional development that actually works. And Jack, just some of Jack's stats earlier on illustrated the importance of that in terms of the relationship between teacher workload and retention as well. So we just can't afford to be wasting precious teacher time on ineffective interventions. It's why in the work of the National Institute of Teaching, you'll notice on our programmes that we talk about being especially respectful of teachers' time. And it's also why we think it's very important that our work is and remains very close to the work of schools. And we talk about being school-led as being one of the really important values that we hold at the heart of the National Institute of Teaching, because we have to understand what is going on in schools, how professional development is experienced by classroom teachers and the leaders who work around them as well. So what else could help when it comes to teacher time? Well, it's a feature of the times we live in that no conversation can pass by without at least a glancing reference to AI. And we think that AI and specifically large language models could have the potential to make affordable, scalable impacts on teacher workload and therefore on teacher time. So I think what we have to do here is just park the dystopian fears, and we need to get practical. And we need to find the ways that we could deploy the tools, some of them that already exist. It's not a case of waiting for the technology to catch up here. Some of the tools that already exist that we can deploy to recoup teacher time and boost teacher quality. So our interests in this domain in thinking about the use of large language models, specifically in teacher preparation and teacher development, but of course there's all sorts of applications we could be thinking about here. I should make it clear, we certainly don't know the answers here yet, but we're alive to the potential pitfalls, but we think that starting with what teachers tell us about their time is the right way to tackle it, and we're hoping to do some work on it soon to try and identify some of those potential practical applications that could have promise. So there are lots and lots of other factors I could touch on, but of course I'm conscious of time. Such as the challenges that are presented by the pervasive challenges in social norms that we've heard lots about already today in terms of what is happening in teaching compared to the wider workforce, and also as an organisation that is both researching and focused on delivering initial teacher training, also about the shifts in the norms and the expectations of recent graduates who are coming through university as well, and the implications that has for how we are preparing people to enter the classroom. I would agree with Jack's call for a revisit to the recruitment and retention strategy, which I think is probably not dissimilar to what Patrick was saying earlier on as well about a workforce strategy. There have been so many substantial social changes, and the context, even if you're focusing just in on the teaching profession, of course, has changed so substantially that it really does feel like we need to revisit that work. In terms of flexibility, and just to pick up on the point that was being discussed on the panel earlier on, and that question from online, it feels there to me like what we need to do is sort of unpack the word flexibility, because sometimes I think that there's a conflation of working from home and flexibility, and actually there's more to flexibility than working from home. Working from home in itself is not necessarily desirable, even though I think perhaps sometimes we jump straight to that being a sort of good thing that everyone wants and that we should try to be enabling. We know that working from home sometimes leads to kind of isolation and a dislocation. And we also know that one of the things that schools are really great at is community, and actually being part of a school workforce and in a school gives you that great sense of community anchoring. So there are potentially ways that we can look at this differently by saying, what is it that schools do really well that can outcompete the benefits that are offered by other professions too. But I'll finish on what I hope will be a reasonably positive note, which is that although we know there are big challenges ahead, and we've got lots of work to do, of course, all of us together, we do need to find a way to talk about what's wonderful about teaching and what draws people into the profession and what keeps them here. So from evidence, of which we've got lots today, to anecdote. I asked my sister, who's a classroom teacher. She's been a teacher for 25 years. She's a secondary science teacher. And I asked her what keeps her there. And so here's what she said. She said, "It's never boring. I enjoy the interactions with the kids. It's fun. I like my colleagues. You're sort of your own boss in how you organise your work. It fits in well with family life, the holidays. It keeps me in touch with young people, seeing kids progress in the 2 years I teach them, seeing kids I used to teach doing well in life. I feel like I'm making a difference, and I feel like I know my stuff." So the challenge, I think, for all of us is in how we show urgency and boldness in tackling what we know needs to change about, without extinguishing the positive messages about the profession that we have got to transmit, so that we avoid the pitfall of potentially making the challenges worse. So thank you very much.
Melanie, thank you very much. That was really useful. We now come to our final speaker, Sinéad Brearty, the CEO of Education Support. and then we will go to a very short 10-minute maximum Q&A.
Thanks a million. My kids got a karaoke machine for Christmas, so I'm managing the Pavlovian response in this moment to holding a microphone. I think we have to take a systemic response to teacher well-being if we're going to make a difference. It is complex, and that's something that I think we all get intellectually, but we lose sight of because we excel at reductionist thinking and at analysing individual components of the problem to a really detailed degree, but we are really poor at joining those things up and seeing the whole and seeing the complexity. I think if we start with children and young people and we talk about teacher well-being, well, we need to deal with material poverty. We have 2 million kids on free school meals. We have children turning up not resourced, not fed, not ready to learn. There's a big hole in your teacher efficacy. We have unmet need in our classrooms, both educational and social and emotional need, which is reported by teachers to have increased to a level that they haven't seen before. And the unmet need is one thing. The lack of support in the wider public service environment is really quite difficult. Teachers are being asked to be the front line of social services. Funnily enough, that's not what they signed up for. So their well-being in terms of the job they want to do is not being supported by that. It's something that we need to deal with and address at the heart of what it means to be a teacher in a school and a school leader if we want to see improvement in teacher well-being. If we come back a little bit, we know from the workplace well-being literature that one of the biggest issues for anybody's well-being in any job is work-life balance, and the inability to switch off from work is a really important indicator of this. I think Francis Green's work on intensity and the intensification of teacher workload is really, really important for us to get to grips with when we link that to the inability of educators to switch off. So if we want to do something to improve their well-being, addressing the dynamics around that, I think, are really key. Line management, management relationships in school are also critical. And actually at that school level, school culture, leadership culture is everything. Through our Teacher Wellbeing Index research, we find almost 2-to-1 teachers report that the culture of their school has a negative impact on their personal well-being versus a positive impact. That's ludicrous. These are people who are motivated by a desire to work with children, to educate, to be in schools, and 2/3 of them find the experience of being there negative in terms of their own well-being. That's about leadership and culture, and we have to do better. We have to stop training school leaders just in technical, pedagogical curriculum, budget management, all the rest of it. We have to invest in people skills, in leadership skills, and we have to deal with the fallout in those school cultures that appears in the sense of how workload is dealt with, whether it's marking policies or data drops, flexibility, the extent to which a school leader is willing to allow people to work part-time or to do a job share and all the rest of it. That's wrapped up in school culture. Getting that right makes an enormous impact on the well-being of teachers. And I guess the other bit, in the wider context, we have to relook at accountability, and accountability in its entirety. I have a 12-year-old and a 10-year-old. I love accountability. I don't love accountability where the externalities are that people are driven out of the profession or feel miserable or feel like they have failed. We have to be able to have an accountability system that doesn't have those externalities. I think the last thing I'd say, because I know other people are going to have far more interesting stuff to say, is about the status of the profession. And I think this, again, is a system level point. We have at some point lost our way in how we look at schools and how we look at education and what we value. And it will take political leadership, in my view, to change that. And that's an investment that we need to make if we don't want to see another 40,000 teachers decide to go and do something else next year and find ourselves with a fully replaced workforce inside 10 years. That is surely nobody's idea of a good outcome. So in terms of teacher wellbeing, I think it has to be holistic. I think we have to deal with the complexity of how the different elements interact. And of course, pay and conditions, and of course, professional development, and great points made by the researchers today. But I think I'd argue for us to hold a systemic view.
Great. Sinead, thank you so much for your comments and for being very concise given our time restrictions. What I'm going to do now, given the limited time, and assuming I have permission from Emily and Josh to run over by 4 or 5 minutes, is I'm going to ask Jenny for 3 questions online. I'm going to take 2 in the room. I'll do the whole lot together, and then I will come to each of the panelists in turn so they can pick up which of the questions they want to pick up. So Jenny, I'm going to come to you first. I'm sorry if that's tricky for you, but if you could nab 3 of the questions you've got.
So the first question is one that's come in the most recently, which is from Ian Horswell, who's asked, the list just shared of what keeps me teaching is a long way from the experience of early career teachers. How can we support them to make it through the bottleneck? And then we've had a couple of longer questions or comments come through as well. So one from Michelle Fuller, who says, why has there been such an upheaval to the teacher education sector, with so many high-performing higher education organisations not retaining their ability to offer initial teacher education, despite the fact that literature widely reported that most graduates were satisfied with their training? This reflects constant churn of change, often of areas that are working, that teachers, both present and potential, are subjected to, and that has a significant impact on the perception of the professionalism of the sector. And then finally, we've got a question from Sylvester Arnab, which is that he agrees with the ambivalent nature of tech, such as AI. We need to ensure teachers are supported and upskilled for applying generative AI in critical and creative ways, and also for using generative AI in developing critical and creative thinking amongst young people.
Great, thank you very much. I can only see one hand in the room. No, there are more hands. So I'm not, so Jenny, I can't take more. I'll take these 3 and then I'll come over to the panelists. There's somebody right at, we'll go with this gentleman first for microphone maneuver reasons, and then the lady at the back, and then the lady in the front row, and might just squeeze in one in the very front row.
Thank you very much. Alex Standish, I work at the Institute of Education, Teacher Education. Just picking up on some of Melanie's and Sinead's points about have we lost our way and how do we improve teacher quality? And obviously time is important, pay is important, lots of things that people have said have been important, but I think we need to get back, we need to think about, more about what is unique about teaching as a profession, and the moral qualities of the job that teachers do, and the way that they engage children in learning through knowledge and culture. And I think if you ask teachers about why they're leaving the profession, often it's the points about they don't mind working hard, but what they don't like is the kind of the busy work, some pointless tasks. So the accountability shift is one change I think we need to address. And I think the second one, I think in teacher education, is that there's been a loss of focus on the theoretical foundations of teacher education, and also that the subject-specific knowledge that we need to develop with teachers, when some universities are more interested in decolonizing their curriculum rather than talking about the value of knowledge and culture that we need to help pass on to the next generation.
Thanks very much. I'm going to try to fit 3 more in, so if you can just be relatively concise with your questions. The lady at the back.
Hi, I'm Rt Hon, Ada Lovelace Institute. I'm visiting senior researcher, AI in education. I have a question for Melanie about your point about AI technology being part of the solution. My question is, what evidence have you got from a teaching force that leads to your proposal that, for example, the technology could be applied to help preparing for materials for teaching? And second question, again, evidence. What evidence have you got that suggests that the existing technology in the area that you mentioned are fit for purpose and effective to deliver what the teachers are asking for?
Thank you very much. I'll take the 2 in the front rows, and then we'll close on questions and come to the panelists.
Hi, my name's Emily McLeod. I'm from UCL.
I wanted to acknowledge that very little has been said today about the patterned nature of teacher retention and recruitment in terms of both gender and ethnicity. So I wondered what your thoughts were about that and what might be done to try and improve that patterned nature. Thank you.
Very much. And last but not least.
Thank you. I just have a couple of kind of questions and maybe comments as well, because I'm Shiponya Telai, by the way. I've been working on the teachers' labor market for quite a few years. And what I wanted to say is, first, what we didn't touch on is that there is a lot of, we have a paper recently published that we look at how turnover affects student performance, which we obviously didn't talk about, but that's, and we do find that on average, it does negatively affect student performance. But what we also find, and maybe you can also give us maybe details or what you think of it, we find that schools that do well, or outstanding schools, for example, by Ofsted, they can manage in a way this high turnover if they face it, because of course they have resources. But it is the schools, as you mentioned, those who have high FSM, proportion of students on FSM, that really do pretty badly relative to these other schools that face higher turnover. And the other thing I wanted to say as well, when we look at on pay for performance, for example, you do see us as well an wage inequality increase. And also you see that also on Ofsted, when we look at how Ofsted affects teachers' labor market, but also whether there's a pay for performance. And you do see that it's mainly that head teachers that either are probably fired or also get most of the benefits of how school does. And I wondered, and you can see that it's the teachers basically that you don't see much on them, or maybe their real pay on average goes down. So I just wanted to think what you think.
Great, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to start with Sinead, then go to Melanie and give Patrick the final word. And I'm sorry that we only probably got a couple of minutes each, but pick which of the questions you think are relevant to you. Sinead.
I'm not taking the AI question, so really happy about that. I think on accountability, I think one of the things that we see a phenomenon in schools around accountability is a defensiveness. And I think that this is where it intersects with leadership. There are a lot of leaders who don't have the capacity and the skills to work out how to engage with the accountability system in its widest sense and protect staff and where to draw the line. I think it's part of our inability to prioritize. We have 750 million priorities or whatever number it is now. And many people are just not able to differentiate and work out how to manage that. And so the defensiveness around accountability is part of what's quite problematic, I think, for teachers and teacher well-being. And it's part of what generates this empty work that we know teachers so dislike. To the point about gender and ethnicity, you're absolutely right, of course. We have just published the Teacher Retention Commission. We spent 6 months talking to teachers in focus groups. The number of women in their 30s who feel they cannot stay in the profession because they cannot be the parent they want to be. And it was women who talked about this more than men. It was gobsmacking. It made me want to weep. I came back to work after a long career break 5 years ago. I wanted to be a teacher. I chose not to be a teacher because I wanted to spend some time with my kids. That can't be good. We have to do better around this. So we are driving women and women in their 30s out avoidably. And I think on ethnicity, we did a piece of research at the back end of last year. I think I'm lost in where we are. Maybe it was the beginning of this year, Patrick, on working with minority ethnic teachers, looking at their well-being, and they experience all the stuff everybody else experiences, and then they experience this additional layer of impact to their well-being that's around discrimination, being treated differentially, being, tokenism, microaggressions, all this stuff. There's a report on our website about it. It's scratching the surface of what we need to do, but there is a very real issue. Roxanne Allen has published some work on Black leaders leaving in disproportionately high numbers. We have a lot of work to do here.
Thank you very much. Melanie.
Thank you. Right, well, I will pick up the AI point because I feel like I should, having been the person to bring the elephant into the room. But in doing so, I think I will ably illustrate that I am by no means the AI expert. So to answer your question, what evidence do I have? The answer is I don't. What I have is a hunch that the developments that are happening here, we need to get ahead of before they get ahead of us. And a belief that actually the best way to go about doing that is to start by working with teachers to identify some areas where we think there might be promise, to do some experiments, to run some trials, and to learn from them, and to see if there's opportunities to scale. And the other thing that prompts me to talk about that today and to kind of put emphasis on it is that I first started working on teacher recruitment at the time in the civil service 25 years ago. And although some of the factors have changed in terms of kind of effects of post-pandemic and so on, this isn't a very different conversation in terms of teacher recruitment and retention than I was having 25 years ago. And we have tried lots of things, and lots of things have not really moved us forward. And perhaps this might be an opportunity. And I think that to make a really substantial difference, or even incremental difference actually in teacher workload. And the thing that makes me hopeful that potentially could be true is the fact that most interventions are likely to be costly, and in terms of teacher workload and therefore teacher time, whereas potentially when we're thinking about the application of large language models, there might be some opportunities to make interventions which are cost effective and therefore scalable, and therefore can deliver a difference at a system level. So I don't know if that's true, but I think we should go and do some investigation to find out. So that's on the AI point. And then one of the questions from those online in terms of the experience of ECTs, and the suggestion that perhaps if you were to ask an ECT why they're in teaching, you might get a different set of answers to the ones I shared from my sister earlier. So that might be true. We're working with lots of ECTs around the country in our schools at the moment, and I think the way that we can start to grip this starts before they take up role as a teacher. It starts when they're preparing to be a teacher in initial teacher training. And as I sort of glanced on earlier on, we have to be thinking about how we respond through initial teacher preparation to those different norms and experiences that the graduating population are joining the profession preparation for the profession with. So it starts with how we respond with that initial teacher training. It does continue, of course, in the structured development that's available now across the first 2 years of teaching through the early career framework. And one of the things that we're doing is building wellbeing model into our own early career framework work support for those new teachers, to make sure that we know what's happening in terms of their well-being, and that we're regularly asking them what's happening, so we can see where there are spikes throughout those 2 years, and then we can take action to address them. But I think it also really importantly does bring us back to mentors, which is something that we kind of quite often end up talking about when we're in this sort of field. The experience of early career teachers, yes, what happens within the early career framework is really important, but fundamental to that is the support that they get from experienced teachers who are playing that role as their mentors. So that's another whole topic that we could spend a lot of time on, but we have to find a way to identify, support, develop, and prize and celebrate those people who are carrying out those vital mentoring roles, because they're the ones that are going to make the difference for early career teachers.
Melanie, thanks very much indeed. Patrick, final word to you, and you might not want to answer this supplementary question, but the TES will probably think I'm negligent if I don't at least ask you whether you've got anything to say about the various leaks we've seen about STRB, and whether you're optimistic that we're going to get a settlement relatively soon. Feel free to deal with that one as you wish, and the other questions.
Well, returning to the AI point, maybe there's an answer there, but I don't want to dwell on it. And Melanie's highlighted the importance of working with the profession. That is crucial. And my worry is that in a quest to find, a desire to find urgent, quick solutions to the workload crisis in schools, and a government that doesn't frankly want to spend a lot of money doing that, because frankly we need many more teachers, that this becomes a quick solution, and it becomes quick and dirty. And I think the questioner was positing, I think, a bit of a view in the way in which you couched your question about how is this working with teachers to ensure it's effective in supporting teachers' professional practice. And I think that's crucially important. So that's all I want to say about AI for now. On the question of both who benefits from, to some degree, extended autonomy in schools, but also the question of the patterned nature of teaching and issues of gender and ethnicity, for example. Really important sets of questions, because our experience and our evidence, speaking to our members and undertaking research with our members, is we know who doesn't benefit. That actually the gender pay gap has widened over the course of the last 13 years. That when we've tried to measure ethnicity pay gaps, they are wide. When we look at the structure of the profession and we look where women and where Black and minority ethnic teachers are employed, if they're employed at all, we see huge levels of job segregation, let alone the points that Sinéad has ably referred to. And I do commend the research from Education Support, because it's fantastic testimonies from the profession, from teachers, about their experiences. So we have a gendered and a racialized system for our teachers, let alone, we can talk about this in relation to pupils as well. I'm sure that would be a another topic for debate. On the question of well, both the question of, I guess, support for ECTs, the upheaval of initial teacher training, decolonizing ITT, which you referred to as a last almost throwaway remark in your question, but also returning to the moral almost purpose and quality of why teachers are doing the job. I just want to say this, that we've got to create space for teachers to be the lead professionals that they want to be. That means agency over their day-to-day work, how you organise your time and all the rest of that. But it also means headspace. It means being able to think about the work that you are doing, think about your subject, to be able to think about the pupils that you are teaching. It's about adopting critical approaches to your thinking and to your practice. My concern, and why was the upheaval undertaken with regard to initial teacher training? My concern is that it was about driving out critical thinking. It was about closing down the space for professional praxis and reflection. And that's dangerous territory, because we're back into the terrain of AI. We're reducing a teacher to technician, and frankly, a bot can do that. I guess then, David's question. If this, my concern, David, is the Secretary of State thinks that the SDRB will solve this for her, and that's why she's not at the table. My concern is, why was that report leaked? It wasn't leaked in your time in the DFE. I've never known recommendations of that nature being leaked. And I have to say, Secretary of State has received correspondence from me asking the question, and frankly, I've had no satisfactory answers to that. So in a sense, the cat's a bit out of the bag, or at least it's poking its head out. Let's see the whole animal, and let's start having the discussion about it. Because the earlier we start discussing what the SDRB has recommended, the closer we'll get to a resolution. And frankly, my members want a resolution to this. My members don't want to be taking industrial action, but they've said to us, you need to ballot us for industrial action, because if the Secretary of State isn't prepared to listen, then we need to act. So I'm hopeful we'll find a resolution, at least to some degree, on headline pay. Just want to make this point. I think that given the constraints upon government, and I've been saying this to the Secretary of State insofar as she'll listen to me, I know there are going to be limits about what government can do on headline pay in the short term, but we need to think about total reward, and that's kind of what we've been discussing this morning, that pay, workload, and the working conditions of teachers, if we can look at those holistically, then we'll probably find a successful and effective resolution to this dispute.
Patrick, thank you very much for bringing it all to a conclusion so neatly. We are now most definitely out of time, and I shall be in trouble with colleagues in Nuffield if I let it run any longer. But can I thank, on your behalf, all of our 3 expert panelists who have been brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. And it only remains for me also to thank Nuffield for hosting this, for funding all the research, our researchers for being here and presenting what I think are 4 really exemplary projects which throw a lot of light on important issues which are topical and which ought to be of real interest to policymakers. So thank you very much. I think Josh wants you to stay and eat all the food out there if you're able to do so. Thank you very much indeed.